Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Facebook land. Um, Thanks for joining me. My name's Kristen Tegtmeier Oertel, and I am the Mary F. Barnard Professor of 19th Century American History at the University of Tulsa, and also the author of the new book, Seeking Freedom in Indian Country, Slavery, Sovereignty, and Resistance Within the Five Tribes, 1790 to 1861. A brief personal history. Uh, I got my BA degree in sociology and history at Cornell College in Iowa, a master's degree in American history at SUNY Binghamton in New York, and a PhD in history at the University of Texas at Austin. No offense, you Sooners fans out there. I took my first job at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, where I worked for 10 years before leaving for Tulsa and the University of Tulsa. And before I get started, again, thank you for joining me this afternoon. And I also want to give a shout out to LSU Press and the entire staff of LSU Press. They have been amazing from start to finish. It's really no surprise to me because I actually published my first book with LSU about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. That first book, Bleeding Borders, Race, Gender, and Violence in Pre-Civil War Kansas, put me on the map as a scholar of 19th century American history, of the expansion of slavery in the West and abolition and the conflict over slavery in the West. And so it was roughly about 10 to 15 years ago when the National Park Service reached out to me. And they said, Kristen, you know something about slavery in Kansas and the Underground Railroad there. Do you know if there are any sites related to the Underground Railroad in Indian Territory? And at the time, this was around 2012, 2013, I didn't know anything about the Underground Railroad. I knew that the five tribes, that is the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Muscogee Creek. I knew that the five tribes were all slave-owning tribes, that they practiced black chattel slavery, but I didn't know much about slave resistance or how slavery functioned in Indian Territory. So I did what all good historians do, and I marched off to the archives. I started at the Gilcrease Museum here in Tulsa. Their library and archives were housed in the old museum building, but are now housed in the Helmerich Center for American Research. And what I found there from the research librarian is she brought me dozens of documents related to Black fugitivity in Indian Territory and some pretty amazing examples of Black resistance. So I thought, aha, there's definitely something here that needs to be investigated further. I didn't have time at that time to dive into the history. I was finishing another book, but I returned to it as quickly as I could. And events in Oklahoma since then have also, I think, made me realize that there's a real need for a synthesis of this history. At the time, 10 to 15 years ago, there were a number of really excellent individual studies of slavery within particular nations. For example, Taya Miles' work on the Cherokee and Claudio Sant's work on the Muscogee, Barbara Krauthammer on the Choctaw and Chickasaw. But there was not a synthesis of all five tribes and an examination of how slavery functioned across Indian Territory. Also, as some of you may know, if you're in Oklahoma, there was a protracted debate within these nations about restoring the full citizenship rights of the descendants of those that these nations enslaved. So they're often referred to as the freedmen descendants. And to date, the Cherokee Nation is the only nation that has fully restored citizenship rights to their freedmen descendants. And the Muscogee Nation is literally right now in the midst of political battle around that question. So I'm hoping that this book and the widespread publicity around it will help inform people about the history of this conflict and perhaps enlighten some of the discussions which have been particularly fiery lately. So I'm going to try to whittle down a 169-page book in a 4-part talk in roughly 30 minutes or less. This is kind of foreign territory for me. It's weird to talk into the void. I always taught at smaller schools, so I lean on interaction with my students. So forgive me if it's strange. I'm having a little PTSD here, COVID times and online teaching, but we're going to try to get through a summary of the book so that we can get to the really fun part, which is your questions. And we're going to leave at least 20 to 25 minutes at the end for your questions. So keep those in mind. You can, I think, type them into the chat. So just briefly, we're going to walk through how and why the 5 tribes adopted Black chattel slavery between the American Revolution and the Civil War. We're going to discuss the forced removal process, which I have called the Black Indian Middle Passage, trying to insert the Afro-Indigenous and African piece of that story. Third, talking about the rebuilding process, how the 5 tribes reconstituted their nations in Indian territory after the devastation of removal, and how they rebuilt their economies and sustained their culture in the face of white settler colonialism. And then finally, resistance. And I'll highlight here the Underground Railroad in Indian Territory, which is kind of the genesis of this project, but also talking about different forms of Black resistance, cultural resistance, and also Indigenous resistance. Indigenous resistance to settler colonialism, to white settler encroachment, is an important part of this story that is often forgotten by Civil War historians. So let's get right to my main argument, which is that in order to understand the causes of the Civil War, we must also examine the changes wrought by forced Indian removal. Without Indian land and enslaved African labor, cotton culture could not expand into the West. Indigenous resistance to white settler expansion, which ironically included enslaving Africans, along with Black resistance to slavery, helped cause the Civil War that would free the slaves, but further oppressed Indian nations. So, how and when do the 5 tribes adopt slavery? And they begin adopting practices of Black chattel slavery in the mid to late 18th century, but it really picks up after the American Revolution. The 5 tribes and most Indigenous nations, and in fact, most human societies, had practiced some form of slavery throughout their history. But it was a slavery that often involved prisoners of war, and those prisoners of war would, in a sense, be temporarily enslaved, and over time, often be adopted into the clan or the tribe. And that degraded enslaved status was not inheritable or passed on to the next generation. Black chattel slavery, of course, is different. Enslaved Africans are treated as pieces of property, bought and sold on the open market. And that was really the lifeblood of the economy in the Southeast around the time of the American Revolution, and especially by the turn of the 19th century. So in a way, it's sort of natural that the 5 tribes adopted these practices, because if they wanted to sustain their economies, if they wanted to continue to trade with the British and then the Americans, this was a means of engaging in that slave-based economy. Now, most of the 5 tribes ultimately sided with the British in the American Revolution, which means the revolution was devastating for their nations. And they ended up on the losing side. They ended up often ceding thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of acres to the Americans through treaties in the in the wake of the revolution. And so they're really facing the United States government from a weakened position at the turn of the 19th century. And there's debates within each nation about how to approach and combat this encroaching white settler advancement. So that debate really coalesces around two sides. Those leaders who believed in selective assimilation, or what I'm calling selective assimilation, and those who believed in violent resistance. So some leaders of the five tribes believed if we sort of put on the face of a white civilized society and adopt elements of white culture, like African chattel slavery, like a written constitution, speaking English, Christianity, if we on the surface appear to be quote unquote civilized according to white opinions, then maybe they'll leave us alone. They keep arguing that they need our land, that we're uncivilized, that we're not using the land properly according to white Christian habits, we're not controlling the land. Therefore, if we appear to be playing by their rules, maybe they will leave us alone. So that's kind of the one side of this debate. The other side are those indigenous folks who believe absolutely we should not assimilate. We should lean heavily into our indigenous culture and ways of life, and we should violently resist white encroachment with every opportunity. And out of this debate between the best way to resist white settler colonialism emerges a number of hot wars. And here I'm referring to the Creek War. And I should add, you can see in the map there, the Muscogee Nation is their technical title right now is Muscogee Creek in parentheses. At the time, they were often referred to as the Creek people. Some Muscogees I know refer to themselves as Creek. Some do not use that word at all and hate that word and refer to themselves as Muscogee. I will use Muscogee as often as possible, but at the time it was really only referred to as the Creek War in 1813 and 1814. And these are those Red Stick Creeks who believe that violent resistance is the way to maintain their sovereignty and maintain the integrity of the Muscogee Nation. The Creek War kind of bleeds into the Seminole Wars. There's three sets of Seminole Wars, but really there's ongoing warfare throughout the 18 teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s in that sort of northern border of what this map shows as Seminole territory and southern Georgia and southern Alabama. These are all really, I mean, they're wars about the US government wanting Indian land. And they will stop at nothing. They keep fighting indigenous peoples as long as it takes to move everyone across the western side of the Mississippi.
Hey, Kristen. I
Yeah.
just wanted to see if you wanted to put the PowerPoint up or if you were going to do it without it. It.
Oh, sorry. On my screen, it's up. Oops. I will take care of that. It's weird because it shifted right as I started talking. Okay, do you see it now? I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I told
No,
you
it's
I'm not good
perfect.
at this.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not
we're
good at
we're
this
there.
online teaching thing. Um, okay. So, I hope you were listening. Wow. All right. So white settler colonialism and let's see here now. Okay. Um, and one example of selective assimilation is Choctaw Chief Greenwood LaFleur. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in what is now the state of Mississippi, which forcibly removed the Choctaw Nation, or much of the Choctaw Nation, to Indian Territory. He also was able to negotiate kind of a rider outside of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek to allow him and a handful of other Choctaws to remain in Mississippi, which partly is why there's still the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. And he remained in Mississippi and became one of the most powerful planters in the region. And this is a picture of his home, Malmaison, which was named after Napoleon Bonaparte's wife, Josephine's home. And Lafleur had a Choctaw mother and a French father, and so sort of had 2 feet and 1 foot in each culture. And I'm going to read a brief description of life on his plantation that I think encapsulates something about slavery in Indian country. The Black men and women who lived and worked on Lafleur's plantation perhaps typify the diverse origins of the enslaved population on southern Indian plantations on the eve of forced removal. Greenwood's father, Louis Lafleur, had acquired Prince, his driver, from the Chickasaws in the 1780s. An enslaved woman named Katrine hailed from the West Indies and was purchased in New Orleans. And Henry and Rosa came from the Upper South, Virginia and Tennessee, respectively. The interstate slave trade supplied antebellum cotton plantations with enslaved workers, as Virginia tobacco planters divested themselves of excess workers like Henry and sold them to wealthy cotton planters like Lafleur. The interstate slave trade populated the growing cotton black belt with enslaved workers, even as it tore apart African families between the upper and lower South. The cotton economy also employed Choctaw women who camped out near local plantations and picked cotton while their male relatives hunted. A rather bizarre example of the resilience of Choctaw gender roles. Though we don't know if Lafleur and his peers employed Choctaw women during picking season, their mixed labor system worked incredibly well. In 1828, Lafleur and his neighbors exported 124,000 pounds of cotton from his port of Greenwood, which is now, of course, Greenwood, Mississippi. So the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was just one of dozens of treaties that forced Indian removal. The end of the Creek War involved a series of treaties. Also, the end of the Second Seminole War, a series of treaties that forced Indian removal, along with the 1830 Indian Removal Act in Congress. So I know many of you have heard of the phrase the Trail of Tears, and the Trail of Tears is actually describes Cherokee removal only, although it's been applied to forced removal for all of the 5 tribes often. The Muscogee phrase, or one of the Muscogee phrases to describe this process, is a road of misery. And what I found in my research is that there were many trails of tears and many roads of misery. You can see some of them outlined here in this map. And the removal process really begins in the late 1820s and ramps up by the mid 1830s. And it's in the 1820s when these early settlers, or some people refer to them as the Western Cherokees or the Arkansas Cherokees, also some early settlers from the Muscogee Nation, the lower Muscogees, moved to Indian Territory before forced removal. And I say that it's forced removal, but it's still pressure from white settler encroachment. They sort of saw the writing on the wall and believed, well, we might as well leave now, perhaps get the best land, and get away from the white man as quickly as possible and try to recreate our lives. Those who did not move, quote unquote, voluntarily, were moved at the point of a bayonet, and that is the U.S. Army forced their removal under armed guard. And those are, I think the more typical stories you've heard of the disease and devastation and loss experienced by the five tribes as they were forced to march across the country. A piece of this Black Indian Middle Passage, which I think a lot of Americans aren't aware of, is that much of this migration westward, this forced migration, occurred via steamboat and on rivers. So you can see some of the paths there on the map and even across the ocean. So the Seminole, the vast majority of the Seminole were forced to remove through the steamboat process. And I have another brief passage that I want to read to describe that. Death during the Black Indian Middle Passage could occur because of disease and poor conditions, or it could result from a maritime disaster. In November of 1837, Lieutenant Sloan, in charge of Muscogee Creek removal, wrote to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs about the tragedy of a steamboat accident, a not uncommon occurrence in pre-Civil War America. He wrote, quote, I learned the melancholy news of the loss of the steamer Monmouth with 500 Indians on board, out of which number 214 souls perished, 31 of which were slaves, the property of Indians. They have lost everything, destitute of clothing, blankets, and cooking utensils. End quote. The Monmouth carried a group of Muscogee migrants and enslaved Africans who must have been terrified when their craft hit another boat in the middle of the Mississippi River and sunk in less than 15 minutes. Their survivors, wet and cold in the November chill, collected all the debris they could, shreds of their former possessions, before having to bury their loved ones, at least those bodies that were not lost permanently to the depths of the mighty Mississippi. Although not a witness himself, Lieutenant Sloan conveyed the devastation experienced by this emigration party, as he called it, and expressed outrage when he heard the rumor that the pilot was drunk. He ended his report with a plea that humanity requires that something be done for these suffering wretches immediately. And of course, little was done, and the devastation and trauma experienced by both African and Indian peoples during this process is really horrific. And it's a story I narrate in the book. And it's one of the reasons I use that phrase, the Black Indian Middle Passage, because as I was reading descriptions of people being packed into the holds of these steamboats and suffering from disease and the trauma of separation from their native homelands, I just kept thinking of the descriptions I've read of the Atlantic slave trade, and there were quite a few similarities. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but the resonances were chilling at times. Of course, there were those who fiercely resisted removal, and Principal Chief John Ross is one of the main figures in this resistance. And he lobbied Congress repeatedly, traveled to Washington, D.C., met with congressional members, and you know, he stood at the leadership of the tribe at a time when he was, I think, directing selective assimilation in order to ensure sovereignty. He learned how to speak English. They developed a written constitution, albeit with a Cherokee language, the Cherokee syllabary. They engaged in plantation-based agriculture. James Vann was one of the largest slaveholders in the state of Georgia in 1810, right? And he was a Cherokee citizen. So he tried to negotiate the sovereignty and maintain the sovereignty of the Cherokee people in DC. But of course, and even the Worcester versus Georgia case decided by the Supreme Court, any lawyers out there or pre-law students know this case, reaffirmed Cherokee sovereignty. But President Andrew Jackson did not care. He ignored the Supreme Court. He ignored Cherokee sovereignty. And a faction of the Cherokees signed the Treaty of New Echota, which many believe was an illicit treaty. And this also created a faction within the Cherokee Nation between what is often referred to as the Treaty Party and the Ross Party, those who resisted signing this treaty and were trying to stay as long as possible in their homelands. Um, of course, ultimately they were unsuccessful. Ross and other leaders of the Cherokee Nation began rebuilding as soon as they moved to Indian Territory. And this is a very imperfect map, but it's one of many that gives you a general idea of where the US government believed these nations should be settled. And it's also a very imperfect map because it refers to the Osage as immigrant Indians. And of course, they were not immigrant Indians, they were indigenous to this region. And clashed with the Cherokee as the Cherokee moved in and tried to take land that they believed was promised to them, but the Osage believed belonged to them. And you can also see the Choctaw in the southern tier along the Red River, and they eventually negotiated with the US government to allow the Chickasaw to have the western part of their allotted land at that point in the late 1830s and early 1840s. The five tribes did rebuild themselves. They rebuilt their economy. They engaged in various kinds of agriculture, corn, but also cotton, particularly along the southern tier of Indian Territory, and ranching. By the end of the 1840s, there were quite successful planters and ranchers, and certainly by the 1850s. They also touted this success in their newspapers. The Cherokee Nation had the Cherokee Advocate. At this point, I think the masthead is from the Cherokee Phoenix, which was the kind of precursor to the Advocate. You can see the syllabary there. And, you know, I mentioned John Ross learned English, but he continued to speak Cherokee as well. And that is true for so many of the quote unquote assimilated Indians or mixed bloods. They might have adopted pieces of white culture, but they continued to speak their native language. And the Choctaw Intelligencer is another example of an indigenous newspaper that touted the successes of Indian country and the five tribes in the region after removal. The enslaved and free blacks who were also forcibly removed to Indian Territory reestablished themselves in a number of ways. There were pockets of free black communities in the region. Here I have a slide that shows John Horse. He was a black interpreter during the Seminole Wars. He facilitated some negotiations with General Jessup, who issued an emancipation proclamation in 1838 that freed hundreds of enslaved people who were enslaved by the Seminole. They basically refused to leave Florida unless they were promised their freedom in Indian Territory. And Jessup somehow convinced the US government to allow that emancipation, and he actually enforced it. And there were officers at Fort Gibson who helped protect John Horse and other free blacks in Indian Territory. So probably the most famous free black community during this time was North Fork, near the North Fork of the Canadian River. But these pockets of independent or what appeared to be independent communities, because some of them were still kind of paying tribute to their indigenous owners and controlled tangentially by their indigenous owners. So they were viewed very negatively by the neighboring slave states like Arkansas and Texas and Louisiana, and they were referred to in those papers as harbors for runaways. In order to control the enslaved population, because most African descended peoples did not live in these nominally free communities. Most of them were enslaved in ways that were very similar to white enslavement. And they passed slave codes that look exactly like the slave codes throughout the American South. Here's just a couple of examples from the Muscogee Nation. Again, every single one of the five tribes passed some slave codes in the 1840s or 50s. I'm just using the Muscogee Nation as an example here. Number 115, no slave shall be carried away from their master's premises without a pass, and then Negroes may have religious worship within 2 miles of owner's premises. But you have to have white oversight or indigenous oversight. You can't worship alone because, of course, they're worried about enslaved people and free blacks getting together and planning to run away or planning rebellion or planning arson. And that brings us to resistance. Um, the Underground Railroad and Black fugitivity was probably the most visible form of slave resistance in Indian Territory. And again, the Underground Railroad functioned in similar ways as elsewhere in the South, as this informal network of sympathetic citizens who facilitated freedom seekers and their desire to take their own freedom and find ways to freedom. The difference in Indian Territory is there were free destinations in all directions, north, south, southwest, and west, not necessarily east. They probably didn't want to go back into Arkansas or Louisiana. But and probably the most successful destination was Mexico. Mexico abolished slavery in 1839. And in fact, the Mexican government even reached out to disaffected Seminoles and Muscogees and enslaved people from those nations and invited them to live in the Coahuila region of northern Mexico, in part to bolster Mexican defenses against incursions from the Plains Indians like the Comanche. So there were routes of the Underground Railroad running into Indian Territory, out of Indian Territory, towards the west to the Plains tribes, the south towards Mexico, and then eventually in the 1850s north towards Kansas. What I also noticed is that a number of the runaway ads out of the hundreds that I found that discuss Indian country or Indian territory in some way, shape, or form look a lot like this one on the screen. Sam and Betty are a couple. There were a lot of couples and a lot of groups that ran away. And this is atypical for runaways in the late 19th or in the mid 19th century. It's more typical for single black men to run away by themselves across other parts of the South. At least that's what the scholarship has told us. And I think it seems like in Indian country, there were more groups running away. I think partly because there were vast distances to travel. For example, probably the most famous example, or hopefully will become a famous example, is the Cherokee slave revolt of 1842. And this is when dozens of enslaved people from the Van plantation, I think I mentioned James Van, who was one of the largest slaveholders, Cherokee Nation in Georgia. His son, Joseph Van, had a large plantation near Weber's Falls in Indian Territory. And Russell Van and other enslaved people on that plantation joined forces with some who were enslaved in Muscogee plantations, and they hightailed it for Mexico. And after a couple pitched gun battles with some Choctaw slave patrols who were actually collecting other runaways from the Choctaw Nation, where they killed these two slave patrols, one who was a Delaware Indian, one who was a Choctaw. And they get captured by John Drew and a Cherokee posse and re-enslaved. Four of them are executed at Fort Gibson, but the rest are re-enslaved, and some of them actually end up working on the steamboat that ended up exploding and killing Joseph Van later in the 1840s. Um, Here's a picture of Coacucci, or Wildcat as the white press referred to him, a Seminole leader who followed the route that the Cherokee slave rebels created in the 1840s. And in 1849, he and John Horse led, that is the black leader that I mentioned earlier, they led a large group of disaffected Seminoles, Muscogees, and enslaved people owned by members of those citizens of those nations. And they led them south to a colony in Mexico. And by the mid 1850s, there were over 300 runaways who lived in this region. And the Texas papers were furious, Louisiana papers furious, slaveholders very anxious about this physical resistance to enslavement and this thwarting of Anglo law in their minds. Alongside this physical resistance is the cultural resistance, and Coacucci was also known to be a spiritual leader. And he and other Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous and African peoples sustained their language, their religion, their medical practices. And I've just got one more example. Um, from the book, one area where both Indigenous and African resistance coalesced was spiritual practices that missionaries and settlers denigrated as savage because they were not Christian. For example, one famous story, which originated along the Red River, spun the tale of one-arm Celia, also known as winged Celia, a conjurer who lurked in the Black community in Choctaw country, wreaking havoc wherever she moved. According to Nancy Cox, the daughter of an enslaved woman, one-armed Celia had wings that stretched out from her back, and she would perch on rooftops before breaking into homes and robbing them. Quote, children and grown people would throw rocks and clubs at her, and she was a terror to our community for several years, end quote, before a man killed her with a silver bullet. In addition to sharing her knowledge about winged Celia, Nancy Cox rattled off a list of plants and herbs that she and her ancestors used to cure various maladies. Hogweed for malaria, chicken droppings boiled with sage for diphtheria. Polly Colbert remembered using similar remedies. Again, like their Indian owners and neighbors, Black settlers and enslaved people practiced what we would now call alternative medicine or traditional healing, resisting and sometimes even besting white doctors' treatments. Blacks in Indian Territory maintained a vibrant healing culture that they had carried with them from the Southeast and from Africa before then. Finally, to wrap it up, a mad dash to the Civil War, because I see the time. Um, so as slave resistance ramped up, as Indigenous nations viewed the opening of Kansas Territory with some trepidation, particularly the Cherokee and Muscogee nations, because Kansas was being invaded, as the abolitionists called it, by anti-slavery settlers and abolitionists. The members of these nations split into pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, just like Americans split into these factions on the eve of the Civil War. The most famous examples of these factions are the Knights of the Golden Circle on the pro-slavery side. This is a group that had chapters all across the U.S. South and became kind of the backbone of the Confederacy. the Knights of the Golden Circle set up a chapter in the Cherokee Nation, and there were some Muscogee citizens who were also members of the Knights, or the KGC, as I call it in the book. On the flip side is the Kituwa Band of the Cherokee, a faction of Cherokees that kind of spun off and believed that their leaders were allying too much with pro-slavery, white-minded citizens, and they were trying to preserve their traditional ways of life and leaned more towards anti-slavery and allied with some anti-slavery preachers who lived in the region. A Muscogee example is Epiphylia Hola, who was a Muscogee leader who ended up leading a group of disaffected Seminoles, Muscogees, and enslaved people trying to escape Indian territory as armed conflict ramped up. They ended up fighting Confederate troops that were comprised of Choctaw and Cherokee citizens and fleeing the region into Kansas, known as the Trail of Blood on Ice, where unfortunately in the middle of winter of 1861, 1860 and 61, sorry, 1861 and 62, they suffered from exposure and horrific frostbite that resulted in amputations and death. Ultimately, all five tribes allied with the Confederacy. There were debates among several tribes about which side to go with, but yes, some wanted to protect slavery, and it was sort of a natural fit with the Confederacy, but they also had been failed so many times by the US government, so many failed treaties, failed promises. They thought, maybe let's try a different approach. Maybe the Confederacy will actually respect our sovereignty. But of course, they didn't either. And they end up fighting on the losing side of the American Civil War and negotiating treaties in 1866 that mandated emancipation of enslaved people within each nation and also bestowing citizenship upon those people. My final and hopefully slightly hopeful note to end on. The war would bring tragedy to Indian country, but it would also proffer a permanent, if partial, freedom for African and Afro-Indigenous Americans. Betty Robertson, who had been owned by a Cherokee family, recalled, quote, "I'm glad the war's over and I'm free to meet God like anybody else," end quote. She proudly announced that she was a good Christian, but also confessed that she kept a buckeye and a bullet in a small pouch to, quote, "keep me from having the nosebleed," end quote. African forms of spirituality and culture persisted, and Betty, whose father had been one of the rebels who bolted from the Van Plantation during the Cherokee Slave Revolt, carried that legacy of resistance in a charm around her neck. Undoubtedly, she passed that legacy on to her grandchildren, whom she noted could now learn to read and write because, quote, "I am free," end quote. Betty's triumph came partially at the expense of her owner's sovereignty, but she found freedom in Indian country. Thank you. And sorry for the lack of slides at the beginning. Um, Questions from the audience. I think there's also info in the chat about how to purchase the book for 40% off, right, Corey?
Yeah, that's right. Can we stop sharing that screen real quick and then
Yes.
perfect. Yeah, it looks like we already have uh, a question in here. I wanted to, yeah, thank you, Kristen, for that wonderful presentation. And I also wanted to thank everyone for tuning in. We have a lot of people here, and I appreciate you spending your afternoon or evening with us, depending on where you're tuning in. And I wanted to shout out a couple people in particular who shared their locale, just so that Kristen feels less alone and more in community with everyone here. So I want to say hi to James Brooks from Athens. Thank you for tuning in. Karen Cox from Charlotte, North Carolina. We have Jeff Kolnick from St. Paul, Minnesota. We have Renate Bartle from Munich, Germany. Thank you for tuning in. I guess it's not too late there right now, but thank you for tuning in late. Patty Loughlin from Tucson, Arizona, and Carol Faulkner from Syracuse, Jason Lang from Leawood, Kansas, Sheila Ferreira from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Yeah, thank you all. We have one comment from Elena Roberts I wanted to read before we got started, Kristen, if you don't mind.
Mhm.
Elena says, so happy to see this book out in the world. Can't wait for LSU to send my copy eventually. So hopefully it's going to get there soon, Elena.
I can't believe she
Um,
hasn't gotten it yet.
we have we have a couple questions already set up. I'm gonna read a couple more comments and then we'll jump in. We have a comment from Curry Augustine here that says, great presentation, joining him from Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us, Curry. And let's see. I'll start actually with some of the questions that we have here, and then I'm going to ask maybe a couple follow-up questions from your presentation that I had some thoughts about. So I'm going to start with David Arturo Perez Sanchez, who asks, what are the periods that this work covers? With the 1840s plantation rebellion in Indian country, how does this extend abolition periods even earlier and challenge previous historiography on emancipation, especially that Emancipation Proclamation of Black people in Seminole Nation?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. I do think certainly it challenges our understanding. I think often historians say that, the Nat Turner Rebellion is the largest slave rebellion in antebellum United States. Um, I'm not sure. I think the Cherokee slave revolt would give Nat Turner a run for his money. I also think that the emancipation in 1838 of hundreds of enslaved people, we don't know the precise number, but we know it's over 300. And I think someone could probably take a deep dive in the archive on that rabbit hole and find out the exact number, or a more precise number. But what I also argue in the book is that the emancipation policies that were discussed and kind of worked through during that process of freeing the Black Seminoles is very similar to the process that occurred during the Civil War. This sort of wartime emancipation and this idea that emancipation is a military necessity. That's the same language that Jessup used in the context of the Second Seminole War. And that language and that philosophy is very similar to what Lincoln and his cabinet used when justifying issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So I do think it's going to kind of bump out the historiography in some interesting ways.
I'm going to get to Karen, your question next, and then yours, Carol, and then I'll get to one of my own, but keep putting questions in the chat as they come to you. Karen was wondering what sources were key to understanding how slavery functioned in Indian Territory.
Yeah, so the papers of the five tribes that are housed at the National Archives and also the Oklahoma Historical Society. I used the microfilmed versions at the Oklahoma Historical Society. That correspondence between Indian agents and officials in Washington, D.C. narrate the history of slavery in Indian Territory. Also, the the newspapers themselves published in Indian Territory were really interesting sources, and some of the papers of the indigenous slaveholders, for example, Peter Pitchland's papers, seeing receipts of his, steamboat, paying steamboat transport to various merchants for shipping his cotton from Choctaw country to New Orleans for sale. So it's the same sorts of sources that historians have been using to write about slavery in the U.S. South. They just have happened to ignore Indian nations.
This question is from Carol Faulkner. Um, Carol asks, given your previous work on Harriet Tubman, Could you expand on the differences in the Underground Railroad between the eastern states and Indian country?
Yeah, so I think one of the big differences and that I mentioned in the talk is just the vast geographic region that had to be covered and the challenging, punishing in sort of weather environments. I mean, trekking through, South Texas in August when it's 110 degrees. Now, Harriet Tubman trudging through Maryland in the winter, equally difficult, probably. I just think the distances were much longer, particularly if you're headed all the way to Mexico. You also had to not only face slave patrols and sympathetic or anti-sympathetic pro-slavery citizens, but you had to deal with the Plains tribes, the Comanche and the Apache, who were defending their territory and perhaps didn't want an underground railroad route of folks to be headed through their nation. So a lot of freedom seekers were killed by Plains tribes as well, and I don't think that's something that Tubman had to face. Of course, she had to face hostile slave patrols and pro-slavery citizens, but not Indian nations who might have been hostile as well.
There's something that you mentioned in the beginning of your talk, Kristen, that I really want to get your take on and just learn more about. And just to set us up, um, uh, just recently, two descendants of Black people that were once enslaved by the Muscogee Nation filed a lawsuit at the U.S. District Court in Oklahoma City demanding citizenship. So I was wondering, this is obviously very much in conversation with what you wrote. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this case and maybe a little bit about McGirt versus Oklahoma, if you, or as much as there, as little as you felt like going into. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this and maybe its relevance from your book.
Yeah, so both of these cases, the McGirt case and the Rhonda Grayson, Grayson is the chief plaintiff in the Muscogee descendants, Freedmen descendants case that was just filed last Thursday in Western District, Federal Western District Court. Both of these cases stem from a treaty that the Muscogee Nation signed with the United States in 1866, wrapping up the Civil War, which established the Muscogee Reservation, but and sort of outlined their land, but also and their sovereignty, but also forced them to free their slaves and bestow citizenship rights on their enslaved people. And in fact, that's what they did. And descendants of freedmen were sort of functioned as citizens within the Muscogee Nation for decades until the 1970s and 80s, when they were basically kicked off the rolls. And now Rhonda Grayson and others are suing the Muscogee Nation. They sued within Indian tribal court and they won. The Muskogee Supreme Court a year ago ruled in their favor and said, yes, according to the 1866 treaty, you should have your citizenship rights restored. But Chief Hill has denied them that right. He has refused to enforce the Muskogee Supreme Court decision. And so, because of that refusal, they had no other choice than to file in federal court. And basically, what they're saying is if you're gonna, the McGirt decision, which ruled that the Muskogee Nation had their reservation had never been disestablished, that native sovereignty exists and is still should be respected by federal law. They say if you're going to enjoy kind of the fruits of McGirt, then you also have to comply with the citizenship that's mandated in the exact same treaty of 1866.
Thank you very much for clarifying that and making that kind of make more sense.
Mhm.
I have a question here from Renate, and I apologize because I don't know how to pronounce this person's name here. But they ask if you used any Heloise Abel's books as a source of information?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Annie Eloise Abel was a pioneer of this history of examining slavery within the five tribes. And in fact, a quote from one of her books ends, I think it's towards the end of the whole book. So yeah.
I wanted to um, maybe talk a little bit more about some things that you have going on as a couple more questions come in. I would say we probably have enough time for one or two more questions. So if you have one, now is the time to put them in here so we can get out of here maybe around the end of the hour. But if we go a little bit late, that's fine. So I wanted to say that you have a couple events coming up that I'm going to put it in the chat right now. But in case you wanted to mention you have a radio show appearance at the African and Indian Table Talk coming up next week. And then the
Hmm.
following week, you have a virtual lecture at the Louisiana State Museum. Is that right?
Yes. So next Wednesday, is that the 5th? At 1 o'clock,
Right.
I'll be interviewed by um, Eli Grayson on his show African Indian Table Talk here in Oklahoma, K-Bob FM. I think that's 89 point something. And then the following week, we have an in-person book launch for anyone who's in Oklahoma or Tulsa. That's at Magic City Books on August 11th. And then 2 nights later, August 13th, is another virtual talk where I will remember to actually share my screen on the first slide. Um, yeah, and that will be on the 13th, the evening of 13th at 6 o'clock. So if you have friends or family who are in Louisiana and want to tune in or want to tune in through the Louisiana State Museum, that's another opportunity. And I believe this is going to be recorded, and I will be mortified when I watch the beginning. So you can share the recording with friends, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Um, I'm going to ask you one more question and then we will get out of here. But before I do, I did want to thank you again for being here with us and sharing your wealth of information. And I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in one more time. Uh, I did put that Magic City Books link in the chat. So it is there if
Thanks.
anyone is interested and is in Tulsa. But yeah, I wanted to ask you, we mentioned, we talked about this a little bit beforehand so I definitely wanted to have time to ask you what you're working on right now that this book is out because you told me that you have this interesting project with some of your students.
Yeah, so I'm part of the Presbyterian School for Indian Girls research team, and that's a team that was developed 6 years ago by my former colleague, current colleague, but former TU colleague, Laura Stevens, who was a professor of English here, and Midge Dillinger, who's the oral historian for the Muscogee Creek Nation. And the University of Tulsa was started as an Indigenous boarding school for Muscogee women in 1882. And it was a partnership between the Muscogee Nation and the Presbyterian Church. And the school lasted from 1882 to 1894, which at that point it sort of transitioned to become Kendall College. And I actually work in the Kendall College of Arts and Sciences now. So, and then eventually it started in Muskogee, but then it was moved to Tulsa and became the University of Tulsa in 1907. So we have a treasure trove of manuscripts at the McFarland Library Special Collections here at the University of Tulsa that narrate the history of this Indian boarding school. And so you can check it out. It's psigproject.org, PSIG project.org. And our undergraduate students research and author biographies, short biographies of the women who attended this school, many of whom went on to great success as teachers, as pianists, as community leaders. And it's been a really fun project to serve as a mentor for our students. But we're taking a year off of mentoring students and the faculty involved in the project, along with Midge Dillinger. We're going to work on publishing an article about the school and sharing information about it with kind of the wider scholarly community.
Kristen, I wanted to thank you one more time for being here with us today. And I wanted to remind everyone that there is a 40% off discount code pinned to the chat. So if you haven't gotten Kristen's book yet, this is a great deal. So you should you should take advantage of it while it's there. Is there anything else you want to say while we're here, Kristen?
No, just thank you everyone for joining me and for supporting me and for buying the book.
All right, until next time. Bye bye.